All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Miracle of 1821, celebrating the Bicentennial of Greece's independence. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for replay afterwards on YouTube. In the Zoom menu along the bottom, you are free to use the chat section, and we'll have Q&A at the end of the presentation. So you can use that if you'd like to send Dr. Polizos a question. You can also ask them directly in chat or email them to hellenism@ahepa.atlscholarship.org. Today's event is hosted by the AHEPA Mother Lodge Chapter Number 1 Educational Fund, which provides both scholastic achievement and financial need scholarships to students pursuing post-high school education. In addition, the fund strives to strengthen community and country by promoting education through the development and implementation of various comprehensive programs. To find out more, you can visit the new website at www.ahepa.atlscholarship.org and then clicking the link there for more information. We're also on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, and would love some additional follows and likes. I'll hand it over now to Colin Cleosis for an introduction of our speaker.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Colin Cleosis, and it is my honor tonight to introduce my favorite amateur historian and retired pediatrician and just all-around great uncle, Dr. Victor G. Polizos. Dr. Polizos is a native of Montgomery, Alabama, born to Greek immigrant parents. He attended medical school in Athens, Greece, and had a pediatric practice in Atlanta, Georgia from 1985 to 2018. And no doubt that those Greek immigrant parents really instilled a sense of pride for his Greek heritage. He has been involved in AHEPA as an active member since 1985, serving in a variety of roles and capacities, including the Educational Foundation and the Committee for the Tribute Olympic Statue in Centennial Olympic Park. In addition to his AHEPA involvement, he's been a huge Hellenic advocate and participated in many different kind of leadership roles. In the Olympics, during the Olympics, he visited over 50 schools as a guest lecturer, sharing his passion for the event. And he also served as a torchbearer not once, but twice. Once in March 31st in 1996 in Tegea, Greece, and on July 18th, 1996 in Atlanta. If anybody has had the pleasure of visiting Montgomery, Alabama, they may have had the opportunity to see the Dr. Victor G. Polizos Library for Hellenic Studies, which was dedicated at Jasmine Hills Garden on April 1st, 2000. He donated over 1,300 books to establish the library. And in 2012, he was awarded the Hellenic Heritage and Public Service Award for the promotion of Hellenism by the American Hellenic Institute of Washington, D.C. And he has also organized many presentations and book signings of prominent Greek American authors for the Atlantic community since 2001. In addition to all of his advocacy, working as a pediatrician, he somehow also found time to enjoy travel, loves photography, undergoing genealogy research, and then probably the most pertinent for tonight's presentation, studying history. And with that, I'm sure you're all going to really enjoy this tonight. I know I'm looking forward to it, and I'll go ahead and hand it back.
Is that a go, Nick?
That's a go for you, Dr. Vic.
Well, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Colin. And thanks to the Atlanta AHEPA Educational Foundation for the honor of speaking to you tonight. A great day in Greek history. So good evening. We're going to start this evening with the church hymn called Ti Permako. It's a hymn sung in our church in praise and in thanksgiving to the Virgin Mary. It's sung also on the 25th of March today during the celebration of the Annunciation. More about that later. First, I will read the English translations and the hymn will be sung by Christina Polizos. O champion general, I, your city, now inscribe to you triumphant anthems as the token of my gratitude. Being rescued from the terrors, O Theotokos. Inasmuch as you have power unassailable, from all kinds of perils free me, so that unto you I may cry aloud, rejoice, O unwedded bride.
Ti Permako, pratigota nikitiria, os litros
Thank you, Christina. So let's have some fun tonight and let's learn a little something too. So let's go ahead and start with the presentation. Nick, the slides are not moving.
Just click on your slide and then click forward.
Not working right this second.
There you go.
Here we go. All right. Dervenaikia, Northeast Peloponnesos, July 1822. 1 month, 1 year, 4 months after the beginning of the revolution and 3 months after the massacre on the island of Chios, attention turns to Dervenaikia. Derven is a Turkish word that means mountain pass. In July of 1822, the Ottoman goal was to advance from north central Greece, past Athens, into the Peloponnese, retake the city of Tripoli, which was their administrative center until a year before, and then eventually the rest of the territories in the Peloponnese and end the war. The Dramalis was the Turkish Passad that was in charge of an army of 20,000 infantry and 8,000 men on horses. Kolokotronis, along with Ypsilantis and Nikitaras, were on the Greek side with 8,000 irregular troops. On the 13th of July, Dramalis and his group reached the town of Argos. It has a fort on top of a hill occupied by 600 men, which were able to manage to hold off the Ottomans for 12 days. Supplies were running low for the large Ottoman army. The summer of 1822 was not a very kind one. It was very hot, making water a huge issue for troops and horses. No relief would be coming from the Turkish fleet. Kolokotronis orders fields and crops burned and all livestock and supplies removed as his army falls back. On the 22nd of July, the Greeks escaped from the castle and the fortress in Argos in the middle of the night. The Ottoman goal now has become impossible because of food and water supply issues, and the decision is made to return to Corinth. But the big mistake, the mountain passes back to Corinth have not been secured by the Ottomans. On the 26th of July, in the Dervenaikia Pass, the Greek troops were stationed and waiting, occupying the higher mountain areas. Kolokotronis' orders were a large part of the retreating army should be allowed into the pass before we attack. The fight begins and the Ottomans were trapped, and the fighting ends with a tremendous Greek victory with thousands of Ottoman casualties and losses. On that particular day, two brothers, Angelis Kleosis and Dimitris Kleosis, fought in the war. They lived in an area very close by. Angelis, the older brother. Dimitris Kleosis is my wife's great-grandfather. Angelis unfortunately died in the war. My brother-in-law, Angeli, and Angelo Kleosis still carries on his name. So the objective tonight would be to talk about the overall sort of 30,000-foot view of some of the history here leading up to the revolution, and then talking about the revolution itself and eventually leading to freedom. And this encompasses sort of a history of about 50 years. No revolution, I'm sure, in the history of the world has been fought that was a very easy thing, and no revolution was fought in a very, very short time. So before we can see what we have, we should look at what we had. So if we're going to look at the Byzantine Empire at its height, if we do away with not worrying about the reds and the purples and just assume it's all one solid color, this would have been the Byzantine Empire at its peak when Constantine the Great moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople. So Constantinople being the start there in the purple area. If we fast forward about 1,200 years and we remove Italy and Northern Europe from the equation, these territories would have been the same that the Ottoman Empire held. Towards the end, 1,100 years into the empire has shrunk, and there's three pockets of what we call the Ottoman kingdom at the point, the Ottoman Empire at the time, and the star again being Constantinople. On May 29th, 1453, the Ottomans were able to breach the walls of Constantinople and take Constantinople and for all intents and purposes in the Byzantine Empire. However, the conquest would go on. There'd be other territories to conquer, and there'd be other territories to take over. And you see by this chart, it would be another 200 years before the Ottomans had complete control of that area, and including the Aegean, which at this point becomes an Ottoman lake. So this map sort of shows a little bit of the territories that the Ottomans held on the European side. So the huge area is referred to as Rumeli, but later on in history, it's kind of more defined as the middle areas of Greece, the northern areas of Greece. And the Greeks in the area were called Rums being the word for Roman. So what was the Greek, the Rum, the Orthodox, the Christian, the Constantinopolitan community or Politan community left with? Well, not a heck of a lot. So the Orthodox Church, the church is what they're left with. And after the fall in 1453, the Orthodox Church is without a leader. The Sultan selects George Gennadios Scholaris to be the patriarch for the Greek people of the Greek Church. He's a monk, he's liked by the local Greeks, and he's very much anti-union. Anti-union meaning he was a person that wasn't excited about talks with the Catholics to reunite the church that had excommunicated each other in 400 years prior to this. The Orthodox Church under the Ottoman rule, Christians were granted some political rights, but were considered inferior subjects. The Patriarch and his court, the Synod, were given the power to hear all religious and civil cases involving Orthodox Christians. Criminal cases and cases involving Muslims went to the Turkish court. Christians could worship freely, but some churches were converted to mosques, taking them away from the Christians. Training of clergy and education in general was limited, and Christians could not place a cross on a building. They could not ring church bells, ride horses, or bear arms. Extra taxes, almost as if it's a religious tax, were placed on Christians, and pressure was applied to convert them to the Muslim faith. The taking of young Christian male children continued. Christian boys under the age of 12, sometimes I see the number at 5, it can go up to age 20, were taken into the service of the Sultan. They were taken and educated, converted, and trained as fanatic elite Muslim troops to serve the Sultan, and they were sent back to guard the non-Muslim population. So if you get the overall view here, they take Christian boys, convert them into Muslims, send them back and guard the territories they were taken away from. So this practice is called Janissary, meaning a new soldier. And the practice was very typical for the Ottoman Empire for about 450 years. The taking of children and the gathering of children has a Greek word, it's called pedomazima. And the practice, as we see above, ended in 1826. The Orthodox Church plays a pivotal role in preserving the religion, language, national identity, and the development of Greek society, and the resurgence of Greek nationalism through education. The priests were at the forefront of some of this, and one of the wonderful examples we have is St. Cosmas, who was born in the early 1700s. He was a very smart guy. He went to Constantinople, he studied. He was very well-spoken, and he got the attention of the Patriarch, who wanted him to go back into the territories, in the Greek-speaking territories, and to educate the population and bring them back to the faith and bring them back into knowing their history and also to know their language as well. St. Cosmas worked many, many tireless years, and unfortunately, he didn't have a lot of friends, and he was turned in to the authorities. And in 1779, he was executed and died at the age of 65. He is known in the Orthodox Church as the teacher of the Greek nation, equal to the apostles. Another reality, or maybe semi-myth, is the myth of the secret school. This painting depicts the priest that's gathered with the young people at night under candlelight, learning and teaching about the faith, about their language, and about their identity. So even if this did not occur wholeheartedly at some point, some of this may have been true, and it could have been in smaller pockets or smaller villages or on the periphery where education wasn't something that was looked at or condoned by the Turkish authorities. But for the sake of the talk, the secret school sort of fits into, or almost fits into, that identity of the priest teaching and continuing religion, language, and national identity. Greek merchants in the 18th and 19th century in the empire, as well as in Europe, generated wealth that could be used to start schools, libraries, and pay for young Greeks to study in Western European schools and universities, exposing them to radical ideas of European Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and thus becoming the seed. So we see that we have merchants who get into the education, who get into the Enlightenment, and it becomes the seed for modern Greek Enlightenment, the Greek word diaphotismos. Some Enlightenment leaders felt that there could be no revolution. You can't fight until you educate the people to know what they're fighting for. One of those was this gentleman here, Philhellenes, who was educated, very smart man, spoke multiple languages, lived in Europe. He was a writer, he was a political thinker, a revolutionary. He believed that Napoleon, who was going through Europe at the time, would be somebody that could be called to help the cause. And on his way from Vienna, where he lived, on his way to Trieste and then into Italy to go meet Napoleon, he was betrayed and executed in Belgrade at the early age of 41. One of the things that Philhellenes liked to do was to write poetry, and some of the poems that he's written have been turned into songs that they sung back then and songs that they continue to sing today. The best refrain is from his poem that was written in 1797, a year before he died, and the words are, "Better an hour of free life than 40 years of slavery and prison." So we talked about the church, we talked about the intellectuals. Now let's talk about other societies that were in the outside of the Balkan area that were sort of very popular and were growing. Educational societies, as well as liberation societies. One of the educational societies, probably the most important, was this particular one that was founded in Athens in 1813 and then in Vienna in 1814. The goals are amazing. They promote education in Greece, funding for poor students, work on classical literature, and preserving of the antiquities. The asterisk there, if we go to the bottom of the page, shows that between the years of 1800 and 1812, Lord Elgin was taking marbles off the Acropolis and sending them back, or storing them and eventually getting them back to England. So you wonder if that preservation of antiquities wasn't spurred by the fact that Lord Elgin was having his way on the Acropolis. The Friends Society became one of the better known and most popular of all the societies, and it started in 1814, and it was organized by two merchants and a student in Odessa, of all places. It became a transnational patriotic brotherhood. It had members from all over Europe, as well as the Balkans. Most of the war heroes that fought in the war on the Greek side, of course, were members of the Friends Society. Its goal was to establish a secret society. Remember what happened to Philhellenes? He was betrayed. The secret society would have the task of overthrowing the Ottoman rule of Greece, and replacing it with an independent Greek state. So the key here is secret society. Very few people knew who was at the top of the society. So in addition to those societies, we have the group of people, the Phanarites, that lived in the Phanar district of Constantinople. This was a district that was a neighborhood around the Patriarchate, where the Patriarch, the head of the Orthodox Church, lived, where his main church was. These were very smart, educated people that were merchants. They were advisors to sultans. They were advisors to leaders in the Balkans in certain areas. So they were very much in the know and very much as movers and shakers at the time, coming from Constantinople itself. Now, we think about 1821 as the first time the Greeks, or we might think about that as trying to gain their independence from the Ottomans, but as we can see, there's a list here of many times and many efforts to kind of do this, but none of them succeeded. So let's pull back the curtain a little bit, and I want to go into something I enjoy looking at, and that's parallel history. And parallel history literally is we're setting the table. So what is going on in the rest of the world or in other places right outside our environment that may be influencing what's happening in our environment? So in 1815, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the countries England, Prussia, Austria, and Russia came together, and eventually France was incorporated in this. And they came together with an agreement that they wouldn't tolerate revolutions in Europe anymore. So the status quo works really well for them, and they wanted to keep it that way. If we look at the rest of Western Europe, we see the leadership there, but the most important ones are right there in the middle. If you look at 1815, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and 1821, ironically, in May of that year, Napoleon dies on the island of St. Helena and the Middle Atlantic. In Italy, they were having revolutionary action too, and the Carbonari uprisings were taking place, but those were quickly put down. In the US, during the time of the Greek Revolution, there's 3 American presidents, Monroe, Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson. They all gave lip service to the Greeks and the Greek independence, but none of them actually came around and volunteered any governmental help per se. Also, if we look at the Western Hemisphere, we can see that, starting again in the middle of the chart, in the 1820s, July, August, we have Peru, Mexico, we have the Central American countries, Venezuela, Colombia, all gaining their independence that same year from Spain. And the following year, Brazil declares its independence from Portugal. So there's a lot going on in the Western Hemisphere. If we look back towards the east and we see the Russians and the Russian Empire, again, they had multiple wars with the Turks as well. And there's the dates of some of them. Again, they shared borders, they shared some interests, they shared some things that they wanted. The Russians wanted more, they wanted influence into the Balkans. They always sort of used the Orthodox faith as a reason to get involved in the Balkans. And the Tsar that's the most important to the Greeks would be Nicholas I. His brother Alexander did not help the cause at all. Under Ottoman leadership, we find Sultan Mehmed II. So he ruled the Ottoman Empire for 30 years. But he had lots on his plate also. He was warring with Persia at the time. He warred with Ali Pasha in northwestern Greece. He was worried about the other Pasha, Mehmed, that was ruling Egypt, that was gaining sort of influence and gaining territories. He was worried about his borders with Russia. And then he was at war with his own army. So he had a lot going on his plate. And the Greeks are doing what? So I put this map up just to show you the sort of topography of Greece, the ones of us that are not familiar exactly with everything. And if we count Albania, Macedonia, Bulgaria, those countries too, that would be the Greater Balkans. And that was the area that the Ottoman Empire sort of controlled. The big star is the one right over the word Greece, is the star that kind of depicts where Ali Pasha and his group lived and his influence was. And Constantinople is way over to the top part of the screen on the right. So Ali Pasha, again, was trying to rule as sort of a semi-independent Turkish sultan. He wasn't a sultan, of course. He had territory, he had troops, he had influence in that area. And so he lived a pretty cush life in that area of Greece. In 1803, he was at war again with the Seleucids. The Seleucids were a Greek faction of warriors who lived in the mountains sort of south of sort of his territory. At times they would be called to kind of fight with him. At other times they would be at war with him. So at one particular time, Ali Pasha got tired of them and went after them to get rid of them or to kill them. So we see that they were fleeing. They fled in 2 groups. The first group made it safely to the coast, and from there the boats would take them to the Ionian Islands. But a group of them, 60 women and children in the second group, became trapped and isolated at the mountains of Zalongo. They performed a traditional dance, knowing that their fate was they would be taken as slaves or would be killed by the Turks. And so this dance, they went around taking turns, and each at the end of the dance of the circle would jump to their death and throwing their children. So it was mass suicide to avoid the capture of the women's group by the Ottomans, the dance of Zalongo. Even though it doesn't fit the dates of the War of Independence, it's still given a lot of credit as being part of that era and part of the War of Independence. So it's given a lot of credit for doing that. In March of 1821, the Philhellenes, the Friends Society, picks a leader, and they picked this guy by the name of Bicentennial, who was a prince, the prince only and title only, and that in the Russian Empire, where he had fought and served in the Russian army. He starts to plan a revolution, and he finds out that the revolutionary forces in the southern Balkan areas, what's now Greece, southern Greece, are not ready to fight. So he organizes an army, and he's going to go in from the north. sort of an area that now would be Romania. He crosses the river with these troops and he's going to start the revolution there, hoping that others will join in later. Well, his plans were very botched up. He didn't do a very good job. Word got out that he was about to do this, and then people started kind of being very smart to the idea, including the Ottomans. And so he procrastinated. Again, the plans were not very smartly done. And after a couple of weeks, he finds that his army is being attacked and being destroyed, and he is running for his life. He crosses the river and goes to Vienna, spends the rest of his life there. So the war began literally by this guy sort of starting it, given some credit for starting it, with no Russian help, even though he had friends in Russia and he had some influence in Russia, and no church or patriarchal at this point support. The patriarch and his office, as a matter of fact, in Constantinople, found out about this fight. They were not in favor of revolution. They wanted everything to kind of be calm, and he didn't want any friction with the Ottomans. And he excommunicated and anathematized the fighters. But in March 1821, in the Southern Balkans, all of a sudden, we see that the history here is going to change just a bit. And we have the arrow pointing to an area in the Peloponnese there, which is where the monastery of Aia Lavra was and continues to be. So the city of Patra, a little bit to the northwest of there, the metropolitan there was Germanos. And Germanos and his entourage were on the way in March of that year towards Tripoli, where they would meet with other church leaders in a periodic church leadership meeting to kind of make sure that everybody's okay and so on. And so on his way there, he stops at Aia Lavra. And at Aia Lavra, on March 25th, 1821, the troops come together, they get his blessing, they raise the standard of revolt, and it shows here in the painting him blessing the standard. This shows a Greek flag, but the real standard of revolt really is this banner here, that if you go to Aia Lavra today, even today in their museum there, you can see it, and it's out, it's visible, it's amazing, it's still around, but it has a needle point there depicting the Dormition of the Virgin Mary. It's a church banner, and the church banner was blessed, and the church banner was given credit for being the standard that would take the troops into the war. So March 25th becomes a very important date, even though there might be other dates that are disputed in early March that could have started the revolution in other places. The government officially gave March 25th the credit for being the date for declaring Greece independence. But also, it's a very important church date. It's the date of the Annunciation. The Annunciation is when Archangel Gabriel comes to the Virgin Mary to announce that she would bear Christ. And therefore, he announces to her what's going to happen and God's decision for her and for the salvation of all of us. So it's called the Annunciation. It's celebrated on the 25th. It was celebrated on the 25th all the time since the beginning of the early Orthodox Church. And now it combines with the holiday of the independence of Greece. Makes sense because they announced that they were going to start fighting the Turks for their independence. It would be the equivalent, I guess, in this country if we combine July the 4th with Thanksgiving Day, where we could celebrate our independence and at the same time give thanks. So that would be sort of the American equivalent of March 25th. Sometimes I found these things very interesting, sort of admirals' journals that were written, a lot of documentation, a lot of the sea captains kept journals, a lot of the military guys kept journals. And this one in particular was interesting. And it says, Mexis in thunderous tones evoked the Greeks' duty to country, faith, and honor. You see that written over and over and over again. Country, faith, you could put in their family, country, faith, and honor. And so you ask the Greeks at that time what they were fighting for, and they'd probably come up and tell you that they're fighting for faith, honor, and country. So we said that the revolution probably started or was blessed in Aia Lavra. There was no fighting there. It was just a matter of the metropolitan being there at that time and blessing the banner and giving his blessing to the troops. But these are the other towns in the Peloponnese where there was some actual fighting. And so starting even a week before the blessing in Aia Lavra. And so a lot of these were very early Greek successes. So This map sort of has the highlight in red of these towns where this early fighting, and the blue is Calavita, and that's where the monastery is. And so just to show you in perspective where everything is, and the town of Patras that's circled there on the upper left will be a town that gets involved in the fight a week later, but doesn't fare very well for the Greeks. So as we mentioned, a week after the declaration in Ielavra, we see Patras, but Patras again, the Greeks do not manage to capture it, and it becomes a very bad massacre for the Greeks. The revolt quickly spread to other areas like Crete, Macedonia, and central Greece. Remember, we talked about the word Rumeli, so central Greece is considered Rumeli. Oh my gosh, we've started a revolution. Yes, you have. Without central command, without communication, without an organized army, an organized navy, a manual for organizing a war, without civilian leadership, without money, without appropriate supplies, and without European or American aid. This is going to take a miracle. So let's take a focus here, a look across the way to Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, where the Sultan resides and where the Patriarch lives. So it's spring, we said March of 1821. The Patriarch at the time is Gregorios V. And as you see the dates, there's 3 different times when he was called in to be the Patriarch to lead the church. This was not uncommon at the time. The Sultan would get upset with these fellows and they would send him away, bring in somebody else to be the Patriarch, and then get upset with them and then bring them back. So his last stint at being Patriarch was the 1818 to 1821 era. April the 10th, 1821 was Easter Sunday. So the Patriarch is in the church and he's doing liturgy on Easter Sunday. The Turkish authorities are outside the door, and as soon as the liturgy is finished, they go into the church and they arrest the Patriarch with his vestments, and they take him to jail and they torture him. He's brought back from jail, and then he's hung at the front door of the Patriarchate. If you go to Constantinople today, Istanbul, and you go to the Patriarchate, you go up these steps, that door in front of us was the main door of the Patriarchate. It was welded shut and painted black. And now if you visit, you go in the side doors that you can see a little bit on the right and the left. So it's done in honor of the Patriarch. A lot of unrest took place in Constantinople. The Sultan sort of gave a free hand to anybody that wanted to, just to go after the Greeks. So this lithograph sort of shows a depiction of churches being burned down, and you see bodies in the streets, and the Patriarch there on the far left being hung at the Patriarchate. So it was a very challenging, very difficult time. Some of those Phanerites that we talked about earlier, these merchants and these people that were in leadership positions in the Ottoman Empire, were also rounded up and they were executed. So there were multiple bishops, archbishops, and priests that were killed on the front lines. The Patriarch's body hung on the front door there for 3 days. Then it was cut down, it was dragged through the streets of Constantinople, and eventually thrown into Bosporus. A Greek fisherman found the body and fished it out of the water and took the body to Odessa. In Odessa, the Tsar claimed that the Patriarch would have a funeral with full honors, and so it was. But interestingly enough, when we think that America is too far away and that we just don't know what's going on, even though it was several months later, this article from the Connecticut Gazette says the Greek Patriarch has been strangled and 4 of his archbishops have been massacred. Again, 4 would have been an okay number, I guess, if you're into massacres, but it was much more than that, much worse than that. The body later of the Patriarch was transferred 50 years later to the cathedral in Athens, Greece, and you can go and you can venerate the relics of the Patriarch in the cathedral in Athens. He's known as a saint in the Orthodox Church, and his feast date is April the 10th, the day of his death. So the question in 1821 is, who's running the war? In the early 19th century, Greeks comprised a patchwork of independent, and that word is bolded and capitalized for a certain reason, because they're independent. Tribes, clans, peasants, scattered intellectuals, schooled in Western Europe, and they dwell in a state of chaos, characterized by shifting loyalties and deceitfulness. So the word organization should say no organization. Again, very independent. This slide sort of shows circles of influence. The deacons, the priest, and the bishop didn't necessarily agree with the ship owners and the sea captains, didn't agree with the land warriors and the fighters. So each of them came to the table, came to the fight, so to speak, with their own agenda. Land control and supervisors also wanted things a certain way, and sometimes they didn't want change at all. So if we look at the Greek army, I love the word irregulars because it sure was irregular. There's two groups, the Amartuli, which were Christian Greek soldiers hired by local Ottomans to enforce the Sultan's authority, and the other group were the Clefs. So they were kind of like the Hatfield and the McCoys in a certain way. And the Greek word for Clefs means thieves, and they dwelt in mountainous areas. Frequently, they recruit from each other, and occasionally they would both come together and sometimes join forces to resist the Turks and to fight them. Despite attempts to organize a regular army along European models, Kleftopolemos was what the Greeks understood and felt would be the best to defeat the Turks. So this map goes back to our general map, and this time I've got it separated a little bit differently just for the sake of being able to understand a little bit better. So we see the east, the big E is northeastern Greece, the W is northwestern Greece, and below the blue line is Peloponnesos, and there was action in all of those areas. But it seems like a lot of the action took place in Peloponnesos, and so we're going to spend time later on in the talk talking about three more battles, and the three that are probably the most known in the Western in Western history. The Greek Navy. There were two merchant groups in the 19th century that prospered. The Greek sailor, who became a merchant ship owner, and the Greek merchants from the islands who became bankers. They're very sort of independent people. They did a lot of shipping and a lot of trading for the Ottoman Empire. A lot of goods that the Ottomans sold or brought in were brought in by Greek ships. Revolutionary Navy was made up of private Greek merchant ships. So there were no government ships. There was no Greek government. We talked about that. Ship ownership gave ships, crews, and money for the cause. So in 1816, an estimated 600 Greek vessels carried more than 17,000 seamen who had contracts with foreign commercial and trading centers. Now, the interesting thing here is, besides the Greek vessels, the Turkish vessels also hired Greeks, so there was a lot of Greek sailors on Turkish vessels. And when the revolution started, they abandoned the Turkish ships and went towards the Greek side. So again, that sort of crippled the Turkish Navy a little bit. This map shows the islands in the Saronic Gulf there, very close to Athens. You see Athens in the upper right area there, which is still where Athens is today. The island of Hydra at the bottom, in the middle of the bottom, and the island of Spetses were two very main big players as far as naval ships, Hydra providing the most, and another island that's not on here, that's in the another area of the Aegean, is the island of Sarad that suffers greatly later on in the war. So battles were fought both on sea and on land, and the islands didn't join right away, but you know, they didn't lag behind too far. A week afterwards, after the declaration of the war, the island of Spetses gets involved in Sarad and Hydra. And the goal of the Navy was to protect the waterways and help in setting up blockades of Turkish fortresses and to bring supplies to the Greek troops. This picture shows sort of the Turkish fortresses. Actually, these are Venetian fortresses. And so when the Turks conquered the area, they enhanced the fortresses or rebuilt the fortresses, and they became very formidable. So if you get an army sort of that's parked at the top of that picture in the middle, very difficult to take. So you can be in there for a while if you've got supplies and you've got water. So these are the fortress towns that dot the Peloponnese, and some of these are circled here in red and in blue. The blue dot, sort of between Napoleon and Corinth, was where Dervenike was, the battle that we started with, and we talked about the first when we introduced the talk. The blue at the bottom, bottom sort of left, is Navarino, which is an important battle that will take place later in the war. And the blue circle without a city in it is the area of Messaloniki, which we're going to talk about also, which is a very important battle site for the war and for the Greeks. Now, we said they had a lot of success early. Why? the Turks were kind of caught off guard. Maybe they suspected Ypsilanti was doing his thing in the north, but they didn't suspect that people in the Peloponnese were going to be starting anything. Maybe there was some insufficiency in the Ottoman ranks. Don't forget they were fighting themselves. They were fighting Ali Pasha and Yanina, and they were worried about that in the northwestern mainland. Troops were sent to fight Ypsilanti and again Moldavia, which again we said was modern-day Romania. And the Greeks managed to find heroic ways of winning or of inspiring. And some report events calling them miracles. Another sea captain says 2 of our ships captured 5 enemy ships loaded with supplies. And the reason this is there is because an important source of Greek supplies came through their successes. So a quantity of weapons, ammunitions, pieces of artillery, and occasionally horses and livestock would be left for the taking if the Greeks managed to evacuate the town or take the town or kill the Turks. This would be left for them to take. In villages, roofs of mosques were stripped of lead that could be melted down for ammunition. And money and jewelry again found in evacuated villages and towns after the battle could pay for troop salaries and buy food. Oh, by the way, there was no organized army, there was no organized government, so there was no way of paying these people in an organized fashion. So the troops would come and go. If they thought they would get paid, they came and fought for a while. If they thought there was nothing coming, they'd go back to the mountains or their villages. So very disjointed sort of situation. We'd be remiss not to talk about the women in the war and how important they were. We mentioned the Sigiotis as women who committed suicide on the mountaintop in northwestern Greece. Later, we'll see the women in the village and the town of Missolonghi also being praised and being helpful in fighting the war. We have 2 other women that were involved in sort of the naval part of this and became very famous for that, for their money and their time and their lives. Mothers, sisters, and daughters, no matter how you cut it, would have been involved in the war. Don't forget, the men were in the mountains fighting or hanging out or avoiding the troops. The mothers were down in the villages, raising the children and growing the crops and taking care of the livestock. So we talked about the Greek successes, but now the tide turns a little bit. We start to see that there's defeats. And the last one on the list in 1821 was Patra. Patra was a city with a castle at the top where the Turks all went to after the fighting started in Patra. And the people in the town were Greeks that were left to their own devices. And when the Turkish Navy landed there, the troops wreaked havoc in the city, killing multiple Greeks there and causing lots of destruction. These stories of destruction and cruel reprisal on any Greek that was captured, lots of stories. Thousands of people were beheaded, butchered, and those not killed were sold into slavery. Those women and children not sold into slavery would return home, find no men or boys, no homes, no livestock. So we see that the history of the struggle consists not only of military victories, but of the persecutions, the slaughter, the dishonor of the defenseless and the weak. So let's take a peek at Chios. Chios is an island in the Eastern Aegean. You see it sort of highlighted here with the arrow. Across the way behind the red lines is the Ottoman Empire, and that's the modern day Asia Minor, Turkey. And at its closest point, it's only 4 miles away. Chios had a population of about 120,000 people when the war started. They weren't really keen on getting involved with the war. Their lifestyle was pretty good. They farmed, they were manufacturers, they sailed, and so they had fairly decent lives. The Turks kind of left them alone, and they also produced this important resin called mastika, and it was sent to Asia Minor into Constantinople, used in gum and flavoring other foods. So again, they were doing pretty well. Below Chios is the island of Samos. Warriors from Samos sailed to Chios, trying to encourage them to get involved with the fight. The Chiotis were not interested at the time. The Samos warriors start to go on a little bit of a rampage there, killing some of the Turks. That news goes across the strait to the Turkish mainland, to the Ottoman mainland, and 40,000 troops eventually come over from the mainland to Chios and start massacring the Choti people. So in April of 1822, orders were given to burn down the town. As we mentioned, over the next 4 months, 40,000 troops land, and their goal not only is to kill, but also to take back the plunder. They thought that it was a rich island that had wealth, and they would each all be able to kind of reap some of the benefits of the plunder. And then at the end, about 3/4 of the population of 120,000 were killed, enslaved, or die of disease. After this prompted the Philhellene, Eugene Delacroix, to paint this painting that hung at the Louvre about 2 years after the massacre. That sort of says everything you wanted to say about the massacre and about the torture of the Greeks and the killing of the Greeks. And this aroused and sort of touched the French conscience, more the people than the government. And so it's kind of helped ignite a little bit more awareness of the plight of the Greeks during the war. With my apologies that this is a late 19th century picture of migration, the reason I want to show this is how important, in addition to all the other really horrible things that happened during the war, migration is up there as well. And the Hoti people that were able to get away, got away. Some of them sailed to the island of Sarah, which would also sort of encounter the same fate as Chios 2 years later. Others went to Peloponnesos with their war stories, and again, to encounter the Ottoman soldiers, again, massacring people. And you have to wonder to yourself, if you're one of those people, well, I escaped this once. I can't believe I'm going through this hell a second time. So who cares about these Greek-speaking, Orthodox worshiping, village living, goat herding, olive grove farming people? I mean, who cares about the Greeks? Well, the Greeks had a wild card, and they had a name for it as well. And the wild card is called Philhellenism. Philhellenism is a friend or a supporter of Greeks or Greece. And so these people played a major role in the outcome of the war and were very helpful to the Greek government with what they did. Almost from the beginning of the revolution, these volunteer Philhellenes, individuals and organizations formed in these multiple countries. They helped move the needle in consciousness about the people's struggle, adding a certain element of passion and enthusiasm. But the European governments still had no interest in getting involved in another rebellion or war, but in a revolution without European government aid would have been a failure. And while the Greeks waited, there was more defeats. We talked about the massacre on the island of Chios, the island of Kassos, east of Crete, was attacked by Egyptian forces and naval forces, and it was decimated. And a rampant massacre there. As a matter of fact, the history says that it took 14 or 15 years before anybody even stepped foot on the island. And that's way after the war has ended. The island of Sarah would undergo that same month, that same year, by Turkish troops and Turkish boats. Again, a complete massacre of the island, with people running for their lives, or at this point, getting on boats for their lives and sailing anywhere that would be safe to get away from the Turkish troops. And an important thing happens in July 1824. The Sultan asked the Pasha of Cairo to help with the fight. He's not being very successful in these battles. He feels that there's an army and there's troops there that are Muslim that he can use. And so the Pasha there sends his son Ibrahim with troops from Egypt, Tunisia, and Albania to the Peloponnesos, and they arrive in 1825. So let's look at what happens in Missolonghi while all this other stuff is going on as well. So I've highlighted on the map here the arrows. The arrows show the dates of wars that were trying to capture the town of Missolonghi, the most important one being the last one. So Missolonghi is interesting because it existed sort of in a marsh. So if we think of Venice in the early days, when people escaped the mainland and escaped the disasters that were happening on the mainland, and they went to live in this marsh, they were pretty safe unless you had a boat that you could row across, but you're not going to get a lot of soldiers on small boats that come across unnoticed. So these people were fairly safe, constantly rebuilding their defenses and their walls to ward off the Ottomans. So lo and behold, enter the picture Lord Byron, George Gordon Lord Byron, one of the most famous Philhellenes, and philanthropist to help the Greek cause. He loved Greece. He became very popular as a poet in England, and he even says in his memoirs that overnight he had a success, and all of a sudden he's this famous person. He has money, he has a title, he has clout, and he loves Greece. So he had been to Greece years earlier, and in 1823 he decides, because of what he hears and news he's getting from Greece, that things are desperate there, and he wants to go and help. He's going to take his money, his wealth, and his fame, and he's going to go there and try to do his best to help the Messalongites. So he arrives on an island in the Ionian Sea, stays there a few months, and then eventually sails across with some supplies and arrives in Messaloniki in January of 1824. This is a beautiful painting that sort of depicts sort of very romanticized depiction of Byron arriving in Messaloniki with the troops there hailing him on, and the commanders there, as well as the fella in the black suit, the politician there, and then the church leadership and the women and children of Messaloniki, all glad to have him come on board. So unfortunately, Byron's stay at Messaloniki is not anything that any one of us would be proud of. He did what he had to do, but the unfortunate thing for him was he died very early. He was there for 3 months. He got an illness. He had fever. Different doctors came in and out to kind of give their ideas as to what his diagnosis were. And the poor guy dies April the 19th, 1824, the day after Easter. And so he gave his name, his prestige, his wealth, and all the funds and supplies he could to the cause. Again, he didn't fight in any battles. He was trying to train troops. He was trying to pay troops. He was trying to bring up morale. And just by his being there was a morale boost for the Greeks. But unfortunately, he died very, very prematurely. The comment was, with Byron dead, the Greeks' cause could not now die. And less than a month later, this news was received in London about his death. So we talked about Messaloniki. We showed the map. We showed the arrows of the 2 sieges, previous sieges. And now the third one starts in April of 1825. The orders to the Passad that was leading the troops to go take Messaloniki was from the Sultan: either bring back the city or bring back your head. So the guy said, I'm not bringing back my head. I'm going to take over the city. But it took him a year. And part of the problem was the Turks didn't have boats that could stop the flow of supplies and water that was going in and out of Messaloniki. The small, shallow boats by the Greeks were being used to ferry in supplies. And it wasn't until the Turks got smart and built their own boats that they were able to seize territories and lands around there and stop the supplies from going into Messaloniki. So on April the 10th, this is now 3 months. Let's say starting in February of that year, the supplies stopped going into Messaloniki. Starvation starts increasing. The comments were that there was no dog, cat, donkey, or horse alive in the city because of the starvation, and it was getting very desperate. And at this point, the Greeks say that what we're going to do is we're going to have a mass exodus of Messaloniki, and we're just going to run for it, because right now we're all going to die here too. The older and the sick would stay in the town, and the young people would try to make a break for it. And this was sort of the painting that was done by a famous Greek artist that kind of shows this exit from Messaloniki. And it's kind of interesting, if you look in the top parts of the painting, you see the angels are holding the crowns, very similar to sainthood in the Orthodox Church, where you see the people that were martyred receiving the crown of sainthood. So it's kind of sort of a semi-religious kind of look there. Delacroix comes back on the scene, and he paints this particular painting. Again, another one that becomes very famous, another one that stirs the conscience of the French people. And it's called Greece, Greece being the woman in the picture here with despair and no hope, expiring on the ruins of Messaloniki. And you see the man's hand that's underneath the stones there, but the woman is showing the desperation of Greece at this point. Word gets out in 1825 that Ibrahim comments that he wants to make the whole Greek population in Peloponnesus, to move them, to carry them off into slavery, or to kill them and repopulate the country with Egyptians and other Mohammedan religions. So this catches the attention of Western Western leaders in these European capitals, and they realized they can't let this happen. And then again, like we said, we just finished talking about Missolonghi. So these Philhellenes, again, we talked about the European ones just a tiny bit. There's a list of some more of them, but also the US Philhellenes get involved. And one of the famous ones is Dr. Samuel Howe, who was a medical graduate of Harvard University in 1824. He lied to his dad and said that, you know, Dad, I could get a lot of experience taking care of wounded in the war in Greece. So it'd probably be a very good experience for me to go there and kind of get involved with the war. But his dad was very much against it, but he went. He helped as a military doctor on the front lines, and later he coordinated all naval doctors for Greece. He never accepted any money for his services from the Greek government. He would return to America to promote the plight of the Greeks, raise money and supplies, and take them back to Greece and distribute them to the population, to the poor people there that were suffering. Another very important guy was Edward Everett. Everett became the first professor of Greek literature, spoke Greek, Latin, and several other languages, traveled to Europe, loved Europe. He loved Greece. He loved Greece. He would give major speeches for the American support to fight for Greek independence, making him a hero in Greece. In 1823, he founded the Boston Committee for the Relief of Greeks. We are spending only minutes to talk about how many Americans got involved in the cause for the Greeks, but these two sort of needed a little bit extra attention, and that's why I wanted to share them with you. Everett is an interesting guy. He had a very, as we would say today, a gift for gab, and so he was a very good orator, and he'd be invited to places to speak. Any Civil War buffs in the audience may recognize Everett because after the Battle of Gettysburg and a few months after the battle, when they were dedicating the cemetery in Gettysburg, he was an invited speaker, and Everett spoke for 2 hours. Following him, Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes. So Everett left his mark in history, both for the Greeks and for the Civil War. Later defeats, again, things are closing in on the Greeks. Things are not looking good. The Acropolis falls in October of 1826. And all of this leads to Western powers now indirectly in the beginning, but later directly becoming involved in the plight of the Greeks. Katsanzaki said, just like the powerful, long-enduring races, the Greek race may reach the depths of the chasm, and exactly there it fashions the miracle. The miracle was the Battle of Navarone. In 1827, in August, ships show up from Egypt. Turkish ships, Tunisian, Algerian ships arrive in the Bay of Navarone in the southwestern part of the Peloponnese. This is an oil painting showing the French and the English admirals going out to meet Ibrahim and to discuss the terms and conditions that he could operate or not operate. And it also shows beautifully the Bay of Navarone with all the ships in it. On October the 20th, 1827, an all-day naval battle begins with the British, French, and Russian ships fighting the Egyptian and the Ottoman ships. The result of this was an enormous victory and a very large step closer to freedom for the Greeks. The Ottomans lost 75 of the 89 ships that were in the bay. The good guys, the English, the French, and the Russians, didn't lose a single ship, and 8,000 crew perished also. So this was a huge step in the right direction. It sort of is forcing the Ottomans now to come to the reality that they're not going to win this war. Some thought that I had was I was putting the talk together was they used a lot, both during this time and even into the modern times, we use ancient history to inspire modern history. So someone must have had the comparison that Themistocles once destroyed a large foreign naval force from the east to save Greece. And in 1827, a large foreign naval force from the east was again destroyed to save Greece. This time, the Greeks would acknowledge with a lot of help from our friends. The last Egyptian troops leave Peloponnesus a year later. Humanitarian aid continues to come in. It's sorely needed. $150,000 is raised on the American side, not counting the other supplies and materials that were sent to Greece. In September the 12th, 1829, the last battle takes place outside of Thebes. The war goals over the years had changed. In the beginning, the Greeks thought that they would take back some territories, possibly Constantinople, and reestablished some form of the Byzantine state. Then as the years passed, they thought maybe we could reestablish some or establish some semi-autonomous state under Ottoman supervision. And then finally, as the war progressed, they established a new independent country. After years of negotiating, Greece was finally recognized as an independent nation in the Treaty of Constantinople in 1832. Note that's about 3 years. There's negotiations going on. The Sultan is not willing to let go. And it finally comes to his senses when the Russians declare war and they're seen on the outskirts of Constantinople. So he does face reality and he signs the treaty. This map here is just to show to you that the dark blue was the initial territory that was the independent new Greek state in 1832. It took another 114 some odd years for all the territories, all the blues and the light blues and the browns. Don't count the yellows in this. That's a different part of history altogether. So that would be the modern Greek state. So it took from 1832 until 1947 for Greece to be the Greece that we know today. I've said a lot, but I want to finish with this thought as I was putting this together. And the title was The Miracle of 1821. I figured the title should be The Miracle and the Birth of a Greek Nation, 1821 to 1829. So now we'll take questions and I'll let our panel folks that do a better job at that than I take the questions and then I'll try to answer some of them and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, Dr. Vic, for that great presentation. We're just waiting for people to come in with any questions that they may have. I've added, Valerie has raised her hand, so she can speak now if she unmutes herself, but anyone else can add them just by typing in the Q&A section or into the chat section.
You're making my life very easy here when you don't ask questions, so yeah, or maybe I was very thorough and answered all your questions.
I have one here. It says from Stephen Georgeson, it says, so the Greeks never had a regular army during the war.
They didn't have a regular army. All of it was, we'll pick up a few soldiers from this area. We'll put a call out for soldiers from this area. And actually, troops from northern Greece sort of mingling or commingling with troops in southern Greece, I don't think happened that often. I mean, they were trying to take care of their own territories and protect their own interests. And so the forces were localized. And so they would have to, again, when there's no money there either, it's kind of hard to entice people to come over to fight with you or to move or to come down the coast and fight with you there. So no organized army. The only thing that was, I mean, they got into arguments time and time again, even amongst the leadership, once they were trying to come together to put together a constitution and declare their independence. And then they had infighting and they arrested one of the generals and then they arrested another guy and then later they let the general go. So they were, again, I call it a miracle because, I mean, they were a mess. So no, there was no organized Greek army. The only thing that came close, I guess, to being organized would be the boats under certain sea captains. And they had influence over a pocket of boats that would kind of go into a lot of different areas and sail distances from their home base.
Thank you. I see one more here from Zach Colias. It says, how did the Greeks form a central government with proper authority after the revolution?
Well, towards the end, they brought in a guy by the name of Kapodistrias, Yannis Kapodistrias. And he was probably the most well-known of the Greeks that was living abroad or outside of Greece. He was from the island of Corfu. He was an advisor to the Tsar in Russia. He had a lot of experience sort of on an international basis, bargaining with other folks in Europe. He made a circle of Europe, meeting with the leadership before he even came to Greece. And then he's the one that started sort of putting the government a little bit together. And then for a while, for a very short time, he also had sort of a free reign to do that. They gave him full authority and power to do that. Now, as he's doing this, there's Greeks that are writing up a constitution, that are trying to put down on paper what's important for the country, what the country should do. The sad thing about Capodistrias is he's assassinated in Napoleon very prematurely. Again, he dies way too soon. And when I read that, I keep thinking about Lincoln and the Civil War. If he had lived, what would have been the outcome? And if Capodistrias had lived, what would have been the outcome? And the foreign forces and the foreign governments get involved, and they assign a king to Greece.
Thank you. I have one from Stephanie Schwartz, and there's a group of people watching from Washington, D.C., so we welcome them. And it says, I'd like to see on that final map slide in the territory that ended up becoming the independent Greek state, which islands were included in that state, and when did the other major island groups become a part of Greece as we know it today?
Right. Well, if we start at the top of the sort of next to the word Aegean, my cursor isn't working right now, so I can't help you out there. But you see that cluster of 4 islands, then the one below, that's the northern Sporades, and then the Kyklades are the cluster of islands right there in the middle of the Aegean. So all those were part of the initial free kingdom or country of Greece. Later in the 1860s, the islands in the Ionian were ceded by the British government to the Greeks. And then as time goes on the early turn of the 20th century, Crete and some of the islands in the Aegean in green become part of Greece. And the purple cluster of islands were islands that were controlled by the Italians in the Second World War. And after the Second World War, they were ceded to Greece, and that becomes the Dodekanisas. So that's the progression of islands. It looks like it would be more organized than that, but then when they're scattered as much as that, it's kind of it's impressive history into its own.
And so who was in charge of this new state?
Who was in charge of the new state?
Yeah.
Well, again, that gets into another lecture, so you can call me back next year and I'll do that for you. But the short answer to that is they appointed a king, and the king was Otto. I mean, Otto was from Bavaria. Otto changed his name to Othon to become more Greek. And he's a very young guy. He comes down with this very young wife, and she was Amalia, very beautiful lady. They ruled as best they could. I think most of the time there was European governments that were kind of pulling their strings a little bit, but the Greeks had enough of them after 30 years, and they sent them away. And then they bring a fellow from the area, the German area, named George, and so he became the king after they got rid of Otto.
Great. And we have one that asks, what happened to the indigenous Turks? Were there massacres of in populations in reprisal?
Yes.
That was from Anastasios Angelides.
Yes, that's a very good question. As a matter of fact, the Greeks were not saints about this either. In some of the battles, especially if you read the description of the Battle of Tripoli, which happened very early on, and the Greeks negotiated with the Turks to surrender. And after the Turks surrendered, the Greeks went there and massacred all the Turks. So they weren't saints by any means. And there was other repeats of that. And so it begs the question, were the Greeks retaliating for what the Turks were doing, or were the Turks retaliating for what the Greeks were doing? But the situation was just pathetic. I mean, they couldn't agree to disagree. They would say, yeah, we're going to let you go. And then all of a sudden the massacre begins. But again, the Greeks were not saints in all this either. They retaliated at certain times in a very barbaric fashion. So there is that written in history as well. And I didn't spend any time talking about that, but I should have mentioned that. Thank you for the question.
And this question comes from William Smitsis. It says, what is your assessment of the timing and level of support of Russia towards our fight for independence?
The Russians, William, in the beginning did not want to get involved. The Tsar did not want to get involved. Remember, they had that peace thing, the European thing, that Kumbaya thing. And so their interest was in influence in getting into the Balkans, using the excuse that these were Christian people, that they were protecting the Orthodox Christians because they were Orthodox Christians too. And so they dragged their feet on getting involved also. Later, when it became more apparent that they could be a little bit more influential, they started to move. And then when they started to move, then England and France got nervous that the Russians were going to move in or stake some kind of claim in that area too. And that's when they started to move. So really, it was like, cat and mouse, who was going to go first? But the Russians, again, the leadership at the top in all of these governments was don't rock the boat. Then the groundswell was from the bottom up. But they eventually got involved. They declared war on the Ottomans, as we said, towards the end. And it was that sort of pushed the envelope with the Sultan to kind of sign a peace treaty.
And following up on that, what did the Russians supply arms to the Greeks, or do you know of any of the what support level support they did?
I don't know. Outside of the ships that they gave and the support they gave through their navy, I don't have any information that they actually ferried in or gave the Greeks any supplies or ammunition that way. As a matter of fact, I don't know, outside of the French, who were put in charge of taking care of all of Peloponnesos at the very end, of Greeks getting supplies from anybody outside of what they captured. So the French came in, they were assigned, they were given something that was agreed by the powers to take care of Peloponnesos, to get rid of all the Ottomans, get them out of there. And they helped quite a bit also in reconstruction of some very basic things like, water, plumbing, roads, and that sort of thing. So they were a help there, but I don't know about arms at all.
And back to the succession, Demetrius Mazakufa asks, any thoughts of why they chose a German royal to become the first king of Greece, and kind of why did that situation exist?
Yeah, that is an excellent question that I'll have to research even more, but my suspicion is they were looking for a young fella with not too much clout, that wasn't a successor to any of the other royal families, that could be semi-controlled, I guess, by the bigger powers in Europe. So this guy was in his late teens when he came to Greece with his bride. So again, I don't have anything specifically that points to him. Actually, there was supposed to be another guy, Leopold, I believe is the name, who was picked again from a German family that was and related to the British crown, that was the first pick by the powers to be the king of Greece. But he didn't want to give up some of the salary that he was getting from the British crown if he came to Greece. And he also became, later on, a few years later, he became the king of Belgium. So he backed out of this, and I guess Otto was the second choice.
Great, and I think that's the last of the questions I have in the chat right now. If there's any last ones, we'll go ahead and ask them. Otherwise, we will end for the night. Anything else you have in closing, Dr. Vic?
No, again, I thank everybody that helped put this together. Nick, your work, William, Ada, everybody that worked to put this together has been invaluable for me, and the sponsorship of the Educational Fund also. And there's just a lot of fun, a lot of information, a lot of history in a short period of time, but hope we left you with a taste of that miracle that we call the Greek nation today. So thank you again, and it was a lot of fun doing this.
Well, it was our pleasure, and I really appreciate you agreeing to do this and putting so much effort into doing that. And I'd like to remind everyone that it is recorded, so if anybody wanted to listen to it again or pass it along, we'll be posting it to YouTube. And do share it, follow us on social media, and subscribe to our newsletter for future events and information on the scholarship program. You can go there again at www.ahepa-atlscholarship.org, and that'll be linked in the description. And thank you all, and good night.
Thank you. Good night.